Welcome to COM 4740, Intercultural Communication. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 2, History of Intercultural Communication. As we venture into the history of intercultural communication, I'd like you to keep an idea at the back of your mind, and that is your own standpoint or worldview and how that has been shaped. Each of us see the world through the lens of our own experiences, our own cumulative life events. For example, if you lost a parent at a very young age, that would affect your perception of other people and the world and its events. Maybe religion has had a big impact on your life, or politics. And these experiences can be profoundly personal and affect us in a big way. So remember that the people that we'll talk about who experienced other points in history were people of their time, and they were looking at the world through the lens of their own standpoint and worldview. That might have included the world being at war at that time, or there being an illness going around at that time, or economic issues of the time. So people tend to be people of their time and make decisions and perceive the world based on their place in the grand scheme of time. So just keep that idea in your mind as we look at these historical issues. Let's start by looking at the origins of the discipline of intercultural communication. Where did this idea of communicating across culture start? Well, it started in the need for governments and for diplomats and for soldiers to interact with people from other countries. So it originates in this idea that we're going to be interacting with these foreigners, and what do they do? What kind of behavior is acceptable to them? What are the social scripts that we can follow that will help us to have a successful interaction with these people? And the idea was that this would be prescriptive, that we could be given a list of rules for how to behave in different settings with different people. I've put a book cover here. This is the book Kiss, Bow, or Shake Hands, the best-selling guide to doing business in more than 60 countries. I have this book on my shelf, and it's a lot of fun. It's kind of an encyclopedia of etiquette in different countries. So say that you're going to Japan. You can flip it open to the Japan pages and see how do they behave around meetings, how do they behave around gift giving or visits to somebody's home, how should you dress if you're invited somewhere, how should you behave in order to be successful in interacting with people there. And then think about another country. Think about, say, Sweden. If you're going to Sweden, you can flip to the Swedish section and see how you should behave there. How should you greet people? How should you behave in a restaurant? Things like that. So it is prescriptive, meaning it prescribes a certain method of being in these different cultural settings. In the early days, the emphasis was on international settings and dealing with quote-unquote foreigners. So the idea was that these people, they are different from us, and we're studying them from the outside, kind of like studying people in their native habitat and then saying, well, okay, if you go and interact with these people, you need to dress this way and behave this way. Do you kiss, bow, or shake hands, for example? So if intercultural communication had its origins in this idea that we needed to learn how to behave with foreigners, what is the modern attitude toward communicating across culture? Well, as we've defined culture in this class, it's more than just race or national origin or dealing with people from other countries or other places in the world. Culture is much broader than that in the modern view. It is a set of ideas and behaviors and beliefs that a particular group of people identify with. So how do you communicate across culture? Well, with this modern view, it's hard to be really prescriptive because culture can vary so much and there can be such subtle differences. So the modern view is that there's no recipe for doing it right. What you need to do is build your own sense of awareness of difference, your own awareness of privilege and how that works, your own awareness of how you view the world and how other people view the world, and build your skills in interpersonal communication and do that well. And if you keep all of those things in mind, communicating interpersonally with empathy and a sincere desire to be understood and to understand others, then you will be successful. So we're going to look at some different ways that we in today's world go about understanding people who are different from us. Modern scholars like you and me usually take one or more of these three approaches to studying intercultural communication. And we'll talk about them briefly here, and then we'll take a deeper dive into each one. These three approaches or methods, ways we can study intercultural communication are the traditional or social science method, the interpretive method, and the critical method. And in the following slides, we'll take a deeper dive into each one. But again, be aware that these three different methods will be used throughout your textbook. So you need to establish a good understanding of what they are and how they're similar and different right now up front in this chapter. The traditional or social science method of studying communication is what a lot of you are probably familiar with as the scientific method, where you count a lot of things and you run statistical analyses on those results and you're trying to predict what's going to happen. So think of a political poll, for example, when they say we surveyed 1,500 registered voters and this is what we think the outcome of the election would be. That's an example of this traditional or social science method. This method gives you breadth but not depth, and what that means is you get a broad range of results, but you don't get a lot of information behind the numbers, okay? So you could survey 20,000 people and get a lot of data points, but you don't have the opportunity to interview each of those people in depth and find out why they answered the way they did. So you get breadth, you get a lot of data points, but you don't necessarily get depth or the information behind them. Your goal here is to count things, generalize, and then extrapolate the results to the entire population. You're trying to be predictive. So let me give you another example. Imagine that you were going to start an ice cream food truck on campus, and you want to find out whether most WMU students would prefer chocolate, vanilla, or strawberry ice cream to be your primary offering, okay? So let's say you survey a sample of 200 WMU students and ask them which of those three flavors they prefer, and you find out that chocolate is the most common response. You might decide that based on this sample of 200 students, I'm going to extrapolate those results to the entire population of WMU students and predict that chocolate ice cream will be the favorite of the majority of students. So I'm going to make sure I carry chocolate ice cream in my ice cream truck. That would be using the traditional or social science method. Now, you're not getting behind those numbers. You're not getting the depth. And what I mean by that is you don't know why people chose what they did. You're not going to find out, for example, that one of the people who answered your survey, their favorite flavor is butter pecan, but since it wasn't on the list, they chose their second favorite. You don't know that. Or why did someone choose strawberry over vanilla? Is that preference a strong one or a slight one? You don't know when you're using this method. You're just trying to get a large amount of data on a very specific question or issue with this method. So if you ever read journal articles with statistical analysis in them, they are usually using this method. The idea behind this method is that reality is out there, something that can be measured and studied, that there is a favorite ice cream flavor out there among WMU students. You just have to find out what it is, in other words. Again, it uses quantitative techniques, or what we call statistics, and such a study would be replicable, meaning that you could redo it and get similar results. If you were to redo the same study every month or every year, you should get somewhat similar results. So this is probably the method that most of you are familiar with in studying phenomena, the traditional social science method. Here you can see an example of the traditional or social science method used to study culture, used to study people. This was a study of 650 first graders looking at their test scores for the first 5 years of elementary school. So you have this group of first graders. They've divided them into low, middle, and high socioeconomic class. They've tested them in first grade. Then they've tested the same kids in second grade, third grade, fourth grade, and fifth grade. So you can see that their scores went up over time for all three groups. You can see the disparities between the three groups. You can see how the gap widens between the three groups. But we have limited information here. We have a lot of data points. There's 650 students in this study, but we don't know exactly what's behind these numbers. Why are some students doing better than others? Why are some improving faster than others? We can't necessarily get at that through this method, but we can get this kind of information. We can get a lot of information, and then we have to take a further step to interpret the information. Our second method, the interpretive method, gives us depth but not breadth. So when we use the interpretive method, we're examining fewer cases, maybe as few as just a handful, but we're going really deep with those few cases. We want to get to know what's behind the numbers, for example. So if you were going to use the interpretive method, you might take 5 of those students in the previous example and follow them for a year and interview their families and try to understand what is driving their improvement in math and reading scores. Now, your results are not meant to be generalizable or predictive to the entire population. You're just saying for this small group that I looked at, these were the results. An interpretive scholar believes that reality is what happens between people in a context. Remember, we said that the traditional scholar believes that reality is out there and you have to find it. The interpretive scholar believes that reality is what happens in a moment between people when they interact. So the interpretive scholar is trying to identify themes, patterns, and relationships in a context. For example, they might interview those 5 people and try to see if there are any common experiences among them. Is there a pattern? Do 4 of those 5 say that they spent a lot of time with tutors and had special tutoring in their math, and that's why their scores improved? Well, then you might say, okay, that is a pattern I am recognizing in this research. So to give you a couple of examples, I wanted to share some of my research and some of my friend Abby's research. We both are interpretive scholars and use these methods. With my research, my dissertation was on faculty diversity at Ohio University, which is the place I was doing my PhD. So I interviewed 25 faculty members at OU, asking them a variety of questions about faculty diversity at OU and their experiences with diversity and people being hired for reasons of diversity. How do students react to diverse faculty? Things like that. And I looked for themes and patterns in those interviews then. What did most of the men say? What did most of the women say? What did the younger professors say versus the ones that had been there longer? Those were the kind of things I was trying to identify in that study. Now notice that I was interviewing faculty, not students. I chose 25 faculty, and it was done at a point in time. So it can't be generalized to all faculty there or the faculty who are there now, because this was several years ago. But you can say for this particular finite group that I studied, here are the things I found out. Okay. My friend Abby did her research with an organization called Back on My Feet. That is a charitable organization that works with homeless people in cities to help them integrate into society and to help them improve their lives. So they do that through running. So the idea behind Back on My Feet is that they work with homeless to get them running shoes and to get them to embrace running as a form of exercise, and then members of the community come and run with them. And it becomes, for many people, a positive thing in their lives because it's something that they can look forward to every day. They're getting exercise, they're getting fresh air, they're getting to interact with people outside of their normal circle. So that is the intention behind the organization. And Abby wanted to study the effects of the program on the homeless participants. So she joined the organization and went running with people in the program and interviewed them during their runs. So she was wearing a recording device on her arm as she ran. But she wanted to find out, what is this program really doing for the participants and how do they really feel about it? Not what are the intentions of the community members involving themselves in this as a charitable act, but what are the experiences of the homeless participants and how do they feel it's affecting their lives in a positive or negative way. So again, it's a very small sample. I don't recall right now how many people she interviewed, but it was a finite group of people, and she worked with the Back on My Feet organization in Philadelphia, and they are in other cities too. So what we can say about Abby's research, it cannot be extrapolated to the general population, But at that point in time, in that city, among those participants, these were the attitudes that she was able to uncover. So I hope you can see that the social science method and the interpretive method, they're different. They aim at doing different things. Neither is better or worse than the other. It depends on what kind of information you're getting at. And they're often used in tandem. So you might do a traditional study first and then do an interpretive study to take a deeper dive into a small piece of the traditional study. So let's look at what happens if you do an interpretive study of these reading scores. When they did interview kids and families in depth, they made some interesting discoveries. One was that the kids from the lower socioeconomic classes had fewer resources in the home than the ones from wealthier families, as you might expect. The lower socioeconomic class kids didn't necessarily have computers and books and things like that in the home. They did most of their learning at school, whereas the kids from higher classes had those resources in the home and also had supplemental things that they were doing. They took different kinds of lessons, or they had tutors and things like that. So that was one thing that was driving the disparity. But another interesting thing that they found out was if you test kids at the end of the school year, the lower socioeconomic class kids show more improvement because they're accumulating knowledge during the school year. But if you test those same kids at the beginning of the next school year, they've lost some of what they learned. It hasn't been maintained over the summer, because they're not going to science camp or things like that during the summer, whereas the richer kids might be. Now for the richer kids, the numbers were more similar from the end of one school year to the beginning of the next one. So this led the scholars to certain conclusions. They discovered that the lower class kids learn more during the year when they're actually in school and have that structure of being in school. But then when they don't have the regularity in the summertime of going to classes, they tend to backslide a bit and lose some of what they've learned. Whereas the wealthier kids tend to retain it more because their learning is not all happening in the classroom. They have many more resources for learning things than just what happens in school. So by taking a deeper dive and doing an interpretive study on just a smaller set of these students, they were able to get behind the numbers in those ways and find out some of the things that were happening to drive these test scores. So which of these methods is best, the traditional or the interpretive? Well, if you put a bunch of communication scholars in a room together and ask that question, you would get answers on both sides. It really is a matter of personal preference and what you're trying to find out. So if you're trying to answer a question where you want a lot of data points, for example, if you're doing a political poll and you want to know if registered voters in your state are more likely to vote for the Republican or Democratic candidate, and that's all you want to know, then of course you want to go with the traditional method because you want to get a lot of data points. If you want to know why people are voting the way they are, the interpretive method might work better for you. And these are often used in combination, as I described with the study of the school children and their tests. You can use a traditional method to get an overview of what's going on, and then use the interpretive method to get a deeper understanding of what's driving the numbers. Our third method of studying intercultural communication would be critical studies. And in critical studies, you are looking at a situation or an encounter between people, and you're examining things like power and justice in that exchange. So studies about feminism, racism, injustices, issues of power are what we would call critical studies. Critical studies question the status quo and say, why is it that way? Don't just tell me that's the way it is. Why is it that way? In the civil rights era of the 1960s, a critical scholar would ask, why do whites and people of color have to drink from different drinking fountains? Why is segregation and busing the right solution, according to those in authority, to racial problems? Those are the questions a critical scholar would ask. Critical studies are sometimes textual or text-based. So you might take, say, the inauguration speech of George W. Bush and the inauguration speech of Barack Obama and compare them for how often did each man mention issues of women's rights, for example. That would be a critical study, that kind of comparison. I want to share some critical studies with you, 2 books and some videos. These 2 books I have on my shelf, and they're both interesting and important critical studies, in my opinion. The first is The Beauty Myth by Naomi Wolf. This is considered a classical study, how images of beauty are used against women. And in this book, she examines how the fashion industry and the cosmetic industry and advertising set up unattainable images of beauty that women are supposed to aspire to, and we're told that we can achieve those by buying their products and also by subjugating ourselves. And Naomi Wolf's contention is that this is a structural method of subjugating women. So this is being done on purpose to force women into certain subservient behaviors, according to this author. So that's an example of a critical study, right? Questioning the status quo, examining issues of prejudice, things like that. The second book pictured here, Don't Play in the Sun, by Marita Golden. It's one woman's journey through the color complex. This book was really fascinating to me as a white person because in this book, the author, who is pictured on the cover, talks about color prejudice within her own community. So color prejudice between African Americans as to how light or dark your skin is. And that is something, as a white person and an outsider to that community, I didn't know about. And when I mention this book in my face-to-face classes, my African American students are always saying, oh yeah, that's a thing, and it's a big thing. But it's something that I didn't know about. So that book was really enlightening to me. And in this, she is examining how within the Black community people judge one another and put one another down or raise one another up depending on the lightness or darkness of their skin, and how that's not only something that is taking place between blacks and whites, but it's happening within the Black community as well. So that's another example of a critical study. The third one, where I have doll studies videos, if you look in the supplemental videos folder here on eLearning, you will see 2 videos in there. There are part 1 and a part 2. They're relatively short. And it was a study they did on CNN. Anderson Cooper hosts it, where they asked little kids about skin color. And it's really fascinating. They ask little white kids and little African American kids about what's the best color skin to have, or which of these children is likely to make friends more easily, and things like that. And the kids are very honest and straightforward about how people react to skin color. So I recommend you watch those if this is of any interest to you. It's a fascinating study, and it's a video example of a critical study. So those are some highlights from Chapter 2 about the history of intercultural communication. Please read the chapter thoroughly. There's more information in the textbook that is important for you to know. Ask me if you have any questions, and I'll see you over in the next video.